After studying this module, you shall be able to know, learn about cohort and cross-sectional research methods, evaluate cohort and cross-sectional research methods, learn about the types of cohort studies.
For example, if we want to study an earthquake hit area, it would be unethical to use randomized controlled study. In situations like these, observational studies is our only option to examine and study the phenomena. Apart from studying effects of natural calamities, observational studies have been extensively used to study clinical population. Prevalence, incidence, causes, prognosis or effect of treatment can be extensively examined in the clinical population by making use of observational studies. Observational studies do not depend on intervention to examine the effect of something on a particular outcome. Rather, they depend on other methods to examine the outcomes. For example, in order to discern cause and effect relationship, cohort study make use measuring events in chronological sequence. On the other hand, if we want to study prevalence instead of discerning cause effect relationship, we make use of cross-sectional studies. Study design with their concomitant objective. Prevalence has an objective of cross-sectional design has an objective of prevalence. Cohort study design has an objective of incidence. Cohort cross-sectional case control study design its objective is cause and effect. Cohort study designs has an objective of prognosis, and control trial study design has an objective of treatment effect. Cohort studies. In a cohort study, we take a sample population also known as cohort. Secondly, the data is gathered from a chosen cohort to determine which participants show specific characteristics. These characteristics may vary for different study. The other important criteria for selection for the chosen cohort may be exposure to particular etiological events, and these may also vary according to the objective of our study. The next part of the cohort study includes studying the specific characteristics or specific exposure condition over a period of time. Advantages of the cohort studies. There are situations in which randomized controlled trial become unethical. In such circumstances, cohort study become mandatory. For example, it would be unwise and unethical to expose people to any form of addiction. Incidence of outcomes of interest can be measured in the exposed and unexposed condition. In a cohort study, the researcher has the opportunity to examine various outcome variables. For instance, a single study can examine various outcome variables, and cohort studies of addiction may also allow us to examine death rate and other diseases related to various addiction. One of the advantages of cohort studies is that it is unbiased. The reason being, in cohort study, exposure is measured before outcome of interest. Disadvantages of the cohort studies. Cohort studies can be expensive and time consuming if not conducted properly. The classification system does not remain static. The individual classification changes with change in exposure over time. Losses to follow up in cohort studies may introduce selection bias. The exposure the subject had may bias the outcome of the study, known as information bias, is a big disadvantage of the cohort studies. Defining objectives. Like any other research studies, it is imperative that in cohort study the objectives are defined clearly. This requires defining the exposure and the outcome of the researcher. Cohort studies can be very costly and time consuming. The reason for this being cohort research design include large number of participants over an extended period of time. Therefore, it is always prudent to carry out these studies when the hypothesis has been explored by other quicker and relatively less costly method such as cross-sectional or a case control studies. Selecting the study population. Practical consideration and hypothesis are the two main factors used to select a study population for the cohort study. The cohort we select can be many types depending upon the objective of our study. The cohort may consist of general population such as people belonging to a particular region or much specific population such as clinical population. The cohort may also be selected on the basis of some special circumstances, for instance, people who have been the victim of an earthquake. Geographical reasons having clearly demarcated boundaries may be taken as general population cohort. Such area offer an advantage in terms of providing baseline criteria from previous studies which have taken into account various factors and have examined variety of outcomes. This confers several disadvantages for the researchers such as examining variety of outcomes with respect to different exposures. Certain studies require that we use specific populations such as professionals in organizations. In such case, it would be appropriate to draw cohort from such population. Selecting a comparison group. Once we have decided upon the exposed group of our study, the next critical step is deciding the comparison group. The researcher has to keep in mind that both the exposure group and the comparison group have to share the similar characteristics in due accordance to the objective of the study, and the only exception being exposure we intend to study. For example, if there is no impact of trauma, both groups share the same psychological profile. Internal comparison and external comparison of group are two main kinds of comparison group which may be used by the researcher for the same purpose of cohort study. Internal comparison group ICG. Heterogeneity is a norm in the general population with respect to different exposure, and this allows classification of members into different exposure conditions. In this situation, we can make use of internal comparison group. In internal comparison, we can make use of participants who totally unexposed or exposed to a very low level. For example, a cohort of Delhi University students can be taken and students can be classified into smoking and non-smoking group. And then over a period of time, the accompanying problem can be examined. Take another example. The cohort of workers in the organization can be divided on the basis of their organizational commitment, and over a period of time their job performance can be studied, but keep in mind that the cohort of workers should be similar in their characteristics, for instance working in the same organization, for the proper examination of the exposure condition and the resultant outcomes. External comparison group ECG. In certain circumstances, a researcher may obtain a homogeneous in terms of exposure to the similar condition cohort, which is quite rare. In such cohort studies, it is advisable to search for an unexposed group with characteristics similar to the exposed group to obtain the objective of the study. For instance, in study hit by earthquake, we can use the population of nearby city which was not affected by the earthquake as the comparison group in our study. Take another example. In certain regions is severely affected by disease. You can take the general population living in the same geographical area as your comparison group in order to compare with the cohort from the affected region. Making use of such external comparison group, as we discussed, has several advantages, but it also has certain disadvantages, which are not feasible for outcomes for which information does not exist for the general population, based on the assumption that proportion of general population exposed to a particular risk factor is relatively small. In spite of the similarities between exposed and unexposed group, there may remain certain differences which may confound the results of the study. For instance, in a study, the kids may be taken from same geographical region, but they may differ with respect to the kind of environment they have at their homes. On the other hand, using special group as an external comparison group overcomes these disadvantages. For instance, information on all confounding variables can be obtained from exposed and unexposed group. Now, multiple comparison group MCG. Multiple comparison group can be good alternative in certain cohort studies. A researcher at times faces situation in which it is very difficult to identify a single group which is similar to exposed group. Under such circumstances, the probability of a confounding of the variables greatly increases, and in such situation it is always advisable to make use of multiple comparison groups to strengthen our study outcomes. For example, In certain studies, it is advisable to make use of both internal comparison group and external comparison group. Take for instance, we want to study the effect of recession on organizational commitment, and for this purpose we use ICG and ECG, that is, we can make use of MCG. Types of cohort studies. There are two types of cohort studies defined according to the point in time when the information on exposure was collected: present, prospective, or past, that is retrospective studies. First we will talk about prospective studies. Data in these studies is the present once the exposure population is defined. A group of people is selected who do not have the outcome of interest. The researcher then measure a variety of variables that might be relevant to the development of the condition. Then over the duration of time, when the people are observed to see whether they develop the outcome of the interest, in single cohort studies, those people who do not develop the outcome of interest are used as internal controls, when instead two cohorts are used and one is treated by the agent of interest and other has not. It acts as an external control. Now the advantages of prospective studies. First, these studies allow use of most updated method of exposure measurement so that bias in exposure classification can be minimized. Second, as these studies study the cause before the outcome, they can more effectively establish the cause-effect relationship. Now, disadvantages of prospective studies. When a certain outcome is rare, then a prospective cohort study is inefficient. Loss of subjects to follow up, and this can significantly affect the outcome. Retrospective cohort studies. These studies make use of the information already recorded for other purposes. The methodology is same as prospective studies, but the study is performed post hoc. The cohort under investigation is followed retrospectively. In this kind of studies, the study period can be many years, but the time it takes to complete the study is only as long as it takes to collate and analyze the data. Advantage retrospective studies. Much cheaper because the data has been already collected. Second, lack of bias because the outcome of current interest was not the original reason for the data to be collected. Disadvantage, people with outcomes are likely to suffer from the recall bias. For instance, they are more likely to remember certain incidents, minimize or exaggerate what they now consider to be a risk factor. The cohort is likely to lack all the relevant information for the reason that it was originally constructed for some other purpose. Now, cross-sectional studies. Cross-sectional studies are mainly used to determine prevalence. These studies are aimed at determining the frequency of a particular attribute, such as specific exposure in a defined population at a particular point in time. All the measures on each person made on a given point in time, and the contact to all the participants is made in fixed point in time, and relevant information is obtained from them. On the basis of information thus obtained, the classification is made whether the person has or has not the attribute under examination. For instance, the prevalence of women smoking in a given population at the time of the survey. Prevalence is critically important to the clinicians because it considerably influences the likelihood of any particular diagnosis and the predictive value of any research. For example, knowing that depression is very rare in teenagers in comparison to the adults enable a clinician to look for other reasons for their social isolation. Cross-sectional studies are also used to infer causation. At a given point in time, it is determined whether the subjects were exposed to the relevant agent and whether they have the outcome of interest. So, the participants were neither exposed to the relevant agent or nor outcome of the interest. This distinction demarcates cross-sectional study from other observational studies where reference to the either exposure or outcome is made. Researchers in social sciences are interested in assessing the attitude of the people toward a significant public event. In assessing such parameters, cross-sectional studies can be made use of effectively. Advantages of cross-sectional studies. Because they do not require any kind of follow-up, cross-sectional studies in comparison to cohort kind of studies are easy to conduct. If you use properly cross-sectional study, You can tell us the need of a population at a particular point of time. Multiple outcomes can be assessed through cross-sectional studies. There are seldom ethical difficulties as subjects are neither deliberately exposed nor treated. Disadvantages of cross-sectional studies. Not useful for investigating rare disease or disease of short duration. In cross-sectional studies, setting time sequence is quite tough. Cross-sectional studies are largely based on the cases which are available rather than on the new cases which are unfolding in the present. Techniques used in cross-sectional studies to obtain a representative sample. Simple random sampling. This is the most common type of sampling technique. In this technique, each and every participant has the same probability of getting selected. First, define your sampling units and then draw up a sampling frame. Make sure your sampling frame should be comprehensive, complete and recent. And make use of random sampling techniques to keep selection bias at the minimum. Once a sampling frame is formed, give sampling units a number. Random number tables can be then used to select a random sample. Using this approach, minimize selection bias. The main strength of the random sampling being it is relatively easy, and its limitation being it is practicable only when the population is not large or spread in large geographical region. The other important point to keep in mind is that random sampling technique is used to select a sampling unit but may not be very feasible in selecting the whole sample from a large geographical area. To select the whole sample, other techniques may be appropriate. Systematic sampling. Many times it is more convenient to make use of systematic sampling than simple random sampling. Arranging the study unit in some kind of order is the first prerequisite of systematic sampling. Then we select a random position from which we would start the selection along with the random starting position. We also select random period interval. This method offers advantage in situations where we cannot make use of random sampling technique directly. One caveat regarding this method of sampling is that the research must avoid any recurring pattern in the interval selected. If this condition is not taken care of, the result would be misleading. Multi-stage sampling. In situation where it is not feasible to either use sample random or systematic sampling, we make use of multi-stage sampling, and it occurs in certain situations because of the following reasons: unavailability of sample frame or the efforts involved in getting one is too great, dispersion of the population over a large geographical area. For example, it would be inappropriate to draw a simple random sample of 150 people from the population of whole country, and even when proper sampling frame did exist, most of the sample would be living in different regions away from each other, and time and expense involved in such sampling would be too much from the viewpoint of practical constraints. Such problems can be solved by making the use of two-stage sampling. First, the source population can be first divided into clusters, for example, regions, villages or districts with a list of these first unit drawn. Second, a random sample is then drawn from the first unit list. Third, from the selected units, a sampling frame of the unit is drawn and a random sample is then selected. The advantage of multi-stage sampling lies in ability to save cost and time. However, it also has a salient drawback that in many situations the clusters are likely to be formed by individuals that are more homogeneous than the population as a whole. For example, people living in same neighborhood or community are likely to be similar in terms of their lifestyle characteristics. In such cases, the individuals from the neighborhood provide less information than the sample of similar size obtained from the whole study population. Stratified random sampling. This method involves dividing the population into distinct subgroups according to some important characteristics such as sex, age or socio-economic status, and selecting a random sample out of each group. Each of these subgroups is called stratum, and a separate random sample is selected for each one. In situations where we want to have independent results for different strata and to ensure an adequate sample size in each one, we can make use of stratified random sampling. Stratified random sampling is particularly useful when the sampling frames are available only for small groups. Study participants. A good researcher knows not everyone in the selected random sample would end up in participating in the study. Some participants would refuse to participate in spite of all the reasonable efforts. Other would participate are the subset of the initial random sample. In spite of it, we should make all possible efforts to ensure a high level of response and participation to minimize selection bias. Also, one should keep in mind that participants who took part in the study are likely to differ from the participants who did not participate. The crucial issue to think about this is, will this introduce bias in the study and how much it is likely to affect the results. For assessing the bias introduced by non-response, it is important to collect some information about the people who refused to participate in the study. To achieve this objective, two approaches are available to the researcher. First, a small sample may be drawn from the non-respondent and special efforts are made to encourage their participation. The findings from this small sample can shed important light on the extent of bias among the non-participants. Second, for people listed for the study, some information might be available. For this, a comparison can be drawn between respondents and non-respondents with respect to basic characteristics such as age, sex, residence and socioeconomic status. Some key points to keep in mind while selecting an appropriate sample for cross-sectional study. Researchers should take into consideration objective of the study, the sample population, the cost involved and the ethical dilemmas before selecting a research design. For a proper sampling, one requires statistical expertise along with knowledge of field condition. Sample size is another important issue to be considered as sample design stage. Generally, a random sample is the most appropriate, but in some situations, other sample may have to be used because of ethical and logistical issues. Data collection for cross-sectional studies. Biological samples, diagnostic tests and questionnaires are some of the most common cross-sectional methods used to obtain information from the participants from the cohort under investigation. All these methods try to elicit information from the participants regarding their exposure, both in their past and presence. The information regarding in the past exposure of the cohort is of considerable importance as it increases the credibility of the cross-sectional method to delineate the cause-effect relationship between exposure and outcome. Summary. Certain research situations are not suitable to study from the experimental research methodology. Rather, they require careful application of observational studies to avoid ethical dilemmas. Apart from ethical dilemmas, a researcher needs to take into consideration objective of the study and the availability of the sample before selecting an appropriate research design. Cohort and cross-sectional study are two main kinds of observational studies. In a cross-sectional study, we select a specific population and examine the effect they show in a single point of time. The cohort in cross-sectional studies can be divided into two categories, exposed and unexposed conditions. Cross-sectional method, like any other research method, has its own advantages and disadvantages. The two main kinds of cohort study include prospective and retrospective study. Four main points of sampling techniques used in the cross-sectional studies include simple random sampling, multiple stage sampling, stratified random sampling and systematic sampling. Out of these four samples, appropriate technique one must also make sure. Out of these four sample techniques, simple random sampling is the most useful as it is most effective in minimizing the selection bias. Apart from choosing this appropriate technique, one must also make sure the participants under the exposed condition should not differ a lot from the unexposed cohort, as this selection bias will lead to confounding of results. Cross-sectional method has an advantage that it can help us determine multiple outcomes. On the other hand, its main disadvantage being it cannot establish cause-effect relationship as effectively as experimental method.